Welcome back to the Unnamed Game Called Worldbuilding series, episode 4. Okay, so how? Part 3, villains. Hey, that title is slightly shorter. Good job, me. My name is Caradwin. I use they, them pronouns. If you haven't seen episode 1 through 3, you probably should because it lays the groundwork for everything we're talking about today. And if you have seen episode 1 through 3 and you came back for episode 4, thank you. I appreciate that. Today we have a special dark mode because we're talking about villains. And who doesn't love villains? One of the greatest things about being a game master is that you also get to run the villains in your world, which means that you get to engage with all kinds of stories and interesting characters who are so far out of the realm of what we would normally play or normally do in the real world or as a player in a game. So it can be a lot of fun to do some villainry. And I include the villains in our world building because they are integral to the world. In many ways, the villains are used as the darkness, like a representation of the evil in the world that you are trying to shine a light on through your gameplay. So by establishing these dichotomous relationships between our heroes and our villains, we're going to have a better platform for launching our story. So that's why I include the villains as part of our world building. And in a lot of ways, as we discussed in previous episodes, your world building becomes part of your plot building, but they are separate. So when we are building our villains into our world, we are looking at their past. We're looking at what made them become villains, and you can do this during your gameplay as you introduce new villains. But if you have a villain who exists in the world before the game begins, then they need to be built into your world building. So as is traditional, we will start with our definition. What is a villain? A character whose evil actions or motives are important to the plot. And I've highlighted here evil actions or motives because you can have complex heroes and villains who have relationships which are sometimes, tenuous and stressful, and maybe the villain is not always doing bad things. One of the reasons why villains are so interesting is because sometimes they do things that seem to be good, and the heroes are very confused about what the status of this person is. But then when you dig a little deeper, you find out that they have evil motivations, and that is what makes them compelling and interesting. That's why we love to see like the Lex Luthors who run full businesses. They have like a whole thing that they do outside of their villainry, but then you find out their motives, and their motives are actually evil. So you can have a villain who appears to be good. But then once you do the digging, you find out that they are not good. And that's a lot of fun and very exciting. But I'm using the term villain here in a very broad and kind of inaccurate sense because we're not just talking about those evil motivated bad guys. In our worlds, we're going to have people who are not necessarily motivated by evil, but who do stand in the way of the protagonists, our main characters, our player characters. And these people would be an antagonist. Antagonists actively oppose or are hostile to our protagonists. And they're also going to be rivals, and rivals are people who share the same goal, and that means that they are not necessarily evil. They are trying to do good, or maybe they are trying to accomplish the same good end, but maybe they have different motivations from the player characters, or maybe they're trying to do different methods that the player characters might not agree with, but the rival has the same ultimate objective. And so when we look at our villains, our antagonists, and our rivals, it's a full spectrum of villainry where you can have these super not evil characters who are still standing in opposition or competing for the same means, and you can also have the I am evil, I do evil because I'm evil kinds of villains. And making sure that you know what kind of villain you're using is going to help you to build the right supports and stories into your world. And I've used the term protagonist a couple of times, so just to define it, it's the leading character or one of the major characters in a drama, movie, etc., which means that that's our player characters. Because a lot of the language that we use for our world building in games comes from literature, it's not necessarily completely accurate. So when I say protagonist, I usually mean player characters, and I'm sorry for the confusion that's going to cause. Anyway, moving on. So I would like to start by talking about a rivalry, and this is one of the first rivalries that I was introduced to as a child, where I was playing Pokemon on my little Game Boy Color back in Yoldi days, and I was introduced to Professor Oak's grandson, I think, whose name was Gary. You could change the name, but that was the default name in my game, and the player character, me, wants to be the very best like no one ever was, and so does Gary. Gary has the same goal as I do, which means that we are rivals. And that doesn't necessarily mean that Gary is a villain. Gary is not, going out there and chopping tails off of slowpokes. But when you have a character who has the same goal, then they become a rival because there can only be one person who is the very best like no one ever was, which means either I will have to defeat Gary or Gary will defeat me, right? So this is an example of a rival being used to motivate the character as we move through the story, because this character is coming back multiple times and I'm testing myself against them to see, how am I progressing? How are my Pokemon leveling up? And do I need to work on some things so that I can keep up with Gary? And rivals can serve this purpose of helping your players know how well they're doing in the context of the world. Gary also represents, what a bad Pokemon trainer is. So since I know that I'm in competition with Gary, it's telling me as the player that I don't want to be like Gary. I don't want to be mean to my Pokemon. I don't want to say, oh, my Pokemon are stupid when I lose a battle, because I want to have a good relationship with my Pokemon. So as rivals, we're also foils to each other. And a foil means that, you're having elements of your protagonist, your player character, drawn out and exemplified or shown in contrast to another character. My player could very easily become like Gary and be mean, but I see what it would be like if I was, and I don't want to be like that. And that's one of the things that rivals can be used for. But a rivalry doesn't necessarily have to be like that. For example, in Toy Story, you have Woody and Buzz Lightyear. Both of them want to be the best toy, but they have different methods of achieving that, and that doesn't put them in an antagonistic position the way that it does between the character and Gary in your Pokemon game, because in Toy Story, they both are generally good. They are heroes, they are motivated by good things, and they do good actions, and they share some allyship, where they are not necessarily in competition against each other all the time in all ways. And as their relationship progresses through each movie or the whole series, they generally become closer to being allies, although they still have some rivalry, which creates some tension and some fun. So you can have rivalries within your player group, you can have friendly rivalries with NPCs, and how much of a given relationship is antagonistic can change and grow over time, and that's what helps give this rivalry a living quality to it, which helps with your immersion and your player engagement. Also, I hope you're enjoying these little drawings. I made them myself and I had way too much fun doing it. So, moving on. As we branch out from some of these children's media examples and look at more grown-up examples, the rivalry between someone like Professor X and Magneto is really interesting because they have a wide spectrum of relationships. We have the hero and the villain, but also they are antagonistic. Sometimes they are allies. They are often rivals. Ultimately, they share the same goal where they want mutants to be safe. However, the means and methods that Magneto uses versus Professor X are very different, which puts them in conflict with each other, and that's what makes them rivals. And yes, Magneto is a villain sometimes. Yes, Professor X is usually a hero, but what we see over the course of their relationship is that they often shift and blend in between these different categories, and different components of their relationship are elevated depending on what the plot needs. And if you just pick up one of the X-Men comic books or movies, you won't necessarily know all of the history between these two figures, but it's always implied and it's always just under the surface. And that's one of the powerful tools that you have when you're doing your world building, is by establishing these long histories between characters that the players are interacting with. You're going to be giving them a taste that there's something more and creating interest. Because on the surface, Magneto is evil. But as you start digging in and picking it apart and learning more, you're like, wow, a lot of these ideologies that Magneto is standing up for are like, I don't know, I kind of agree with that. And that's what makes them interesting as world elements and motivators for plot. A true antagonist is different, though, because when you have someone who's a true antagonist, then they are pitted against that main character, the protagonist, in every way, and that still has the opportunity for change and growth. For example, in Avatar: The Last Airbender, the TV show, not the movie, Zuko wants to regain his honor, and that motivation stays true throughout the whole thing, but that motivation is not inherently evil. He is not actually a villain, but he is an antagonist because his goals are against what the main characters want, which is, to not be kidnapped and turned into the Fire Lord. And what we see over the series is that Zuko's motivation stays the same, but his idea of what regaining his honor means changes. And because that changes, it becomes more in line with our hero protagonists and what their goals are, which means that he shifts from being an antagonist to a protagonist. And you can build that into your world as well. When you're building up these antagonists, you can think about what avenues there are for them to change and grow and to turn them into an ally or maybe even a hero themselves. And there will come a day when I do one of these episodes where I don't talk about Star Wars. But today is not that day, because we cannot look at a antagonist journey without talking about Anakin Skywalker. So we're going to start with episode 2. And if you haven't seen Star Wars, what are you doing? Go watch Star Wars. Anyway, if you haven't seen Star Wars, there are spoilers here. So Anakin Skywalker starts out in episode 2 as being ostensibly a hero, a good guy. And we see that his relationship with Obi-Wan Kenobi is one of allyship. They are working together to achieve the same goals, but they are kind of rivals because while they do share the same goal, they have very different methods of going about it. They have different values, and the things that they care about are different, and that antagonism grows. As we get to episode 3, we start to see that Anakin is no longer just a rival. Now he's also starting to actively work against some of the goals that Obi-Wan Kenobi has. And that antagonism is represented in a visual transformation where we start to see Anakin literally go dark, and then the whole thing happens, and whatever, go watch the movies if you don't know what I'm talking about. By the time we get to episode 4, now we have a clear hero and villain. No longer is this just antagonistic. Darth Vader is motivated by evil, he does evil, and he's a bad guy, and Obi-Wan Kenobi is old, and eventually he starts to fade out of the picture. And in the absence of having someone to actively oppose, Darth Vader is not an antagonist, he's just a villain, and he's just doing bad things. But when we get introduced to Luke Skywalker, who is a hero, now Darth Vader becomes an antagonist because he is working against. And that is what creates that interesting spectrum where, yes, he is evil, but he is also actively interested in opposing what Luke Skywalker is doing. Similarly, Luke Skywalker is actively opposing what Darth Vader is doing. So this little spectrum can happen in your games. You can build characters into your villainry who have these complex backgrounds where maybe they weren't always a villain, maybe they became antagonistic, maybe they grew and they change, and maybe there is a chance for redemption. Maybe they can do a Zuko, and some people believe that Darth Vader was redeemed, which is a totally different conversation that I'm not going to get into right now, unless you want to get into it, in which case let's chat in the comments. But my point is that antagonism, villainry, rivalry, they are spectrums and they can coexist, and sometimes your villains becoming allies is a really fun and interesting thing where, maybe we have some crossover where we have some ideological differences, but we have the same desires for the end game, and each of us will have our different reasons for supporting or opposing this kind of relationship, and that is a lot of fun. And if you build that into your villains in your world, that's going to create excellent opportunities for roleplay. So let's talk about some of the problems that you can run into as you are building these villains into your world. I think the two biggest things that happen in games is that villains are either too boring or they are too big. For example, in pretty much any Marvel Cinematic Universe ensemble movie, the villains kind of tend to be boring, generic, faceless CGI monsters, and that's not very interesting. And this works just fine in a movie because we don't really care about the villains. We're here because we want to see the rivalries between our protagonists. But when you're running a game, you need to make sure that your protagonists have something to buy into, that they have some reason to care about what these villains are doing. And just because somebody is doing evil doesn't mean that they're interesting, because it's not necessarily that the evil is happening that we really care about. When we're looking for roleplay opportunities, we're looking for those interesting, complex motivations. And a bad guy doing bad because he's bad and he's going to do bad stuff is, less interesting. So you don't necessarily have to create a Magneto type villain who has a really complex backstory, but it is good to have a villain who has some sort of a buy-in and relationship to your player characters, that they have motivations that your player characters are interested in, and so that there are some stakes here, because at the end of the day, we know that the player characters are probably going to win. And that means that the stakes need to be built in other ways, where there need to be consequences and real things that are going to happen that are bad. And an apocalypse is not very interesting. What's interesting is when you have a consequence that the player characters are going to have to address, where if we don't succeed in stopping these bad guys from blowing up this bridge, then the people on this island are going to starve. That's interesting. And we know that even if the player characters don't win, now they have something that they can do to follow up. And having the opportunity built into your world for the player characters to understand the motivations is going to be really helpful for encouraging your roleplay, and it's going to help to enhance the stakes, because when you know that there's a action and a consequence and there's a desired outcome for two different sides, then you can play off of that and you can build off of that and make it more interesting. Another problem that you sometimes run into is when your villain is too big. For example, when I talked about the Cascadon Corner Cthulhu incident, sometimes your villain is just too big. And if they're too big and they're too powerful, then they also become uninteresting because I know that I can't fight them now. I know that I can't do anything about them now. And that's kind of a metagaming thing. But I think realistically, when your player character is level 1, they know that they are not a god slayer. Like, we know our limitations and our capabilities. So when the monster that we're facing is so huge, like, it's kind of uninteresting because we know that we're not going to fight them now. We know that we can't do anything about them now. So why do we care about them now? And it's really easy to circumnavigate this problem by creating, lots of smaller villains with their own motivations who all support this big villain. And that's kind of what they did with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where they keep teasing that Thanos is going to be part of the problem, and then eventually Thanos becomes a problem. But like all of the movies that come before that big confrontation, they're not fighting Thanos, they're fighting agents of Thanos, and they may or may not even know that they are fighting agents of Thanos, even though we, the audience, know. And this leads into our next concept here, where how to address these boring and big villains is to give them interesting support structures. Because when you're fighting these villains who have organizations that support them, then your player characters can sort of work up the ranks of trying to defeat them. When you have generic evil bad guys who are just doing evil for, evil reason, well, having them be working for some organization or some group or some company helps to put that motivation in a different place so that your players can then discover that motivation through these sort of generic bad guy fights. Some examples of structures that you can use are like companies, like Lex Luthor. He runs a whole company. Governments, where you can have government entities or agents or military folk who are doing bad, like you see in the Hulk. Or you can have cults, like religious followings that are supporting some evil deity. And by building in these structures, you can create hierarchies and different ways that these companies or governments or cults operate, which will give you an indication of what their values are and who they are and why they're doing what they're doing. These structures can also become set pieces where you have, a headquarters, or you have a temple where your player characters can go places and do things and find stuff out. And they also will have interactions with common people, which means that you will have a wide range of interactions with NPCs who are, just everyday folks who have opinions about these companies, governments, or cults. Maybe they like them. Maybe they support them. Maybe you can see some of those interesting, like, incongruous things where this evil corporation is also planting trees. And you can have the illusion of being a good guy. And then as the player characters start fighting these bad guys and they're like, oh, wow, did you see this guy has an ID badge for this, like, headquarters at NIH? Like, how weird is that? And, like, having that kind of stuff involved means that your player characters are going to be making discoveries. And discoveries are part of what makes the mystery, and mysteries make your villains interesting. So when your villains have support structures that build them up, that give them a broader spectrum of impact, you're going to avoid that too boring and too big problem. Not to mention, having those structures is going to help make your villains feel more real, because in the real world, you don't have one guy doing one bad thing in one bad place. What you have is a network of people who share goals and ideologies who are working together to accomplish their end means. And that is the same that you have in good guys too, right? Our heroes are also going to have their structures, which we're going to talk about in a future episode. So when you're looking at your villains, think about how they are accomplishing what they want to do. What resources are they using, and what structures will support them in attempting to achieve their goals? And when you do have a standalone villain who doesn't necessarily have big structures supporting them, you need to make sure that they're really interesting. For example, Loki and Zemo are two really good examples of these villains who exist sort of outside of these support structures, and they're acting as their own independent agents. And sometimes they work with organizations, sometimes they manipulate organizations, but in general, they're working by themselves, and that can also work. But to make that work, you have to make them interesting, and you have to give them really unique motivations, and they have a lot of flexibility to move between this ally-rival antagonist relationship where, your player characters aren't necessarily going to know where they stand with these characters at any given time. So when you don't have a support structure, you really need to make that villain incredibly strong and very well grounded in the world. And this is an example here where you've got these characters who are written into the world in very different and unique ways. For example, your Loki character is built into one player character's background. They have integrations into one of the settings. They have ties into, one big organization, and they grow out through it. And what you see is as the Loki character interacts with our player characters, the Avengers, they grow and change, and Loki becomes something different. And every time you see Loki, you never know what kind of Loki you're going to get. And then eventually Loki gets his spin-off series, and then you get to find out a whole bunch of other stuff about how he needs to love himself. But moving on. So the difference here is that when you have someone like Zemo is integrated in a very different way, because Zemo is the product of things that the characters have done in sort of gameplay. And obviously the writers aren't looking at it this way, but if we were imagining the Marvel Cinematic Universe to be a tabletop role-playing game, then there was a consequence that came out of the crashing of this country. And when this country crashed, this villain was born. And this villain exists as a response to what the player characters did. And that's really interesting. In the same way that Loki changes based off of the interactions with the player characters, Zemo was born because of what the player characters did. And you can introduce these kinds of standalone villains, which are a consequence of things that the players have done. And these are so exciting and compelling because it shows your player characters that even when they do good things, they can have a negative impact, and there are consequences for what they're doing. And it helps to make the world feel very real because now, I have to address this issue. I have to deal with this, and there are consequences of the choices that I've made. And that can be a lot of fun. And villains ultimately are there to make your characters realize that there is more to the story than what they think. Because every villain has a motivation, and those motivations might not necessarily be evil. And that's where they become the antagonist. That's when they become rivals. And those sort of nuances and the depth that you build into them can help you compensate for not having a big structure or organization behind them, because the characters themselves are so interesting. So when we're looking at these excellent villains, they all have some things in common, right? No matter whether they have an organization behind them, or they're acting alone, or they're created by the world before the game starts, or they're created as a consequence of the player's actions, all of these villains have complex motivations, and they usually serve as some sort of a foil to a protagonist. A foil is a character whose purpose is to accentuate or draw attention to the qualities of another character, most often the protagonist, which means that what the player character is embodying, the attributes about them, are going to be exemplified in some way by this antagonist. And this is where we get the sort of you and I, we're not so different after all kind of thing, because an antagonist is usually someone who could have been a hero under different circumstances. Because when you have somebody who responds badly to a situation, they become the antagonist, they become the villain, and what makes somebody hero is they respond to bad situations in a different way. And this kind of foiling helps to make your villains very interesting, and your player characters are going to be excited by this because they're going to see pieces of themselves and their characters in this antagonist, and they're going to, have opportunities to role play with them and talk to them and be like, I've been where you are, I know what you're feeling, and they can experience this empathy, and that makes for really compelling role play. So that's a really good tool to use if you can create this foil relationship between your antagonist and protagonist. Another thing that we see is that these villains, these really good antagonists, they tend to grow in power along with your player characters. So as Thor becomes more powerful, Loki becomes more powerful. As Professor X builds a team, Magneto builds a team. And this kind of parallel growth helps to keep them interesting and challenging, because if at some point you can just walk over to your bad guy and knock him over, well, that's not very satisfying. But if your bad guy is growing alongside your good guys, that's going to be much more compelling and satisfying when you do face them. And they have responses. They do things in response to what the player characters have done. We see these really cool protagonists' actions have really interesting consequences. And because of the way that roleplay games are structured, these really cool things are not necessarily written before we get to it, right? Because a player character might roll a really good die and change the outcome of how your game was going to go. Which means that you need to keep these excellent villains flexible so that they can respond to the outcomes of the story that is being told. Because if you've already written in that, the antagonist is going to do X, Y, Z, and then they're going to be defeated. Well, that's not very interesting because you've closed off a whole bunch of opportunities, right? Maybe you can just be a little more flexible, a little more open, and that means that the player characters can take actions which allow your antagonist to grow and become more worldly and maybe shift into those, ally positions. And that ability to change from one thing to another, I think, is a hallmark of a really, really well-written villain, because at the end of the day, all people are people. And by making your villains people rather than monsters, then they're going to have the opportunity to grow, to change, to be interesting, and that builds into your world. That builds your world in such a way that it is going to be able to grow and to change. Because, like we've said, this is not a book. We're not writing a book where we dictate the ending. We're writing a game and a world where people are going to be able to make changes and have real impacts, and your villains are a tool that you can use to accomplish that. So when you are making your villains, there are some things to consider. What kind of villain is this NPC? And that means analyzing their motivations, their backstory, and how they relate to the world, and like what sort of support structures they have. Because if you have that consideration in your world building, then you're going to help integrate them into your world so they don't just feel like a generic bad guy slapped onto your setting. And you also need to think about how their relationship to the player characters might change. By building that into your villain's construction, you're going to be providing avenues for change, and if you keep your options open, that helps to enhance the immersion and give your player characters real stakes in what their relationship with this antagonist is going to be. And also make sure that your villain is appropriately scaled for your adventure, and that doesn't just mean checking your challenge ratings, right? We also want to make sure that our villains aren't too big to be defeated. We want to make sure that they are introduced at the right time, and that if they are a very large character, that we're building in those support structures through having different lieutenants that they can fight, so that our player characters can work their way up and meet the villains at the right time. Maybe they hear about the villains early on, but they don't actually know that they're villains, and they learn that through these different smaller fights, right? And that helps to create that sort of crescendo into the main battle. And also make sure that they're interesting. It should go without saying that your villain should be interesting. But when you're looking at their motivations, if their motivation is, I want to do evil because evil is good, that's not interesting. That's not going to feel realistic. That's not going to feel compelling. And when you're doing your world building, if you take the time to really consider the motivations, that's also going to provide other avenues of exploration for your world building. What made this person the way that they are? Because people aren't born villains. They are made villains by their environment, by their society, by their interactions and their responses. So when you're doing your analysis of these villains, you're also looking for opportunities to build your world in a more diverse and interesting way, to give it complexity, because it can't all be good. There has to be stuff in your world that is bad, and even your good guys can do things that have negative ramifications, which can help to motivate the growth of a villain. And I think that's a pretty good place to stop. So yeah, that's episode 4. Okay, so how? Part 3, villains. And next time we're going to talk about allies and the structures that support them, because that's a pretty obvious way to go next, right? So if you enjoyed this episode, please like and share your comments. I would love to have conversations about some of your favorite villains and what you think about what I think about villains, because, everyone has their own opinions about, well, Star Wars and other things, but mostly Star Wars, let's be honest. I want to talk about Star Wars with you. So feel free to drop in the comments, and I hope that you come back next time for part 5, where we talk about our allies and their structures. And if you would care to stick around, we are going to now take a trip to the Cascadon Corner. There is so much that I could talk about. It's hard to know where to start. But I want to talk today about Sessek, who is the main sort of villain in my world, and he is the god of healing. He is also the god of suffering, and his philosophy is that you have to be alive in order to suffer, so he wants people to live forever, which means that he's developed incredibly powerful cults of healers to support his endeavor. So he has this spectrum that ranges from those incredibly powerful healers who are going out and doing good things, all the way to the other end of the suffering side, where you have these really powerful healers who are causing people incredible pain and then healing them from it, because, that way you can make them suffer again. And one of the doctrines of this faith is that you can do no harm that you have not yourself endured. And I think that's really interesting, because that means when you find a follower of Sessek who's doing harm to other people, you know that they know exactly how much that hurts. And man, that's crazy. And this extends beyond just the physical suffering. They also engage in mental and emotional suffering and different kinds of torture and torment in that way. And they become, embedded in political societies because they're really good healers. So every noble, every royal has a Sisekian doctor, and that puts them in a position of immense power. And your normal player characters are going to have very different responses and reactions to meeting a Sisekian priest. Because if you don't know about their broader spectrum of faith, if you don't understand that there's this, equal measure of good and evil going on, then you're not necessarily going to understand why it's such a bad thing. For example, in my party right now, I've got two people who are from a very poor barony where there aren't a lot of nobles, and therefore there's not a lot of power, and they don't really have a lot of opportunities to get healed. So a Sisekian priest rolling through town and, just curing people of their ailments, that is magic. That's really good. That's super powerful. That's a really nice thing that happens, and that is something that happens fairly regularly. And then on the other side of that, I have a player character who was raised by a former Grey Twin, which is an organization of Asians who are dedicated to defeating Sesek because they see all of that dark and terrible side of the suffering that is being caused by Sisekians. So this character has a totally different relationship because they know the evil that is Sesek. They know that dark side. And so this creates interesting conversations when the player characters are interacting with the Sisekian. And I really like having good people working for evil organizations. I think that's a very realistic thing because most of us in the real world, we don't necessarily support the core values of the companies that we work for, but we have no choice but to work, which means that we are, whether we like it or not, supporting these organizations that we don't necessarily believe in. And this is exacerbated by the fact that many corporations that we do work for also do good things that we do support and we are fans of. And it's like, oh man, it just creates this tension that I feel very realistically represented in my world because I feel that tension whenever I work for a company. I know that I'm working for the bad guy, but I also know that my bad guy is doing some good things. And I also know that I really don't have a choice because I need a job. And so I really like incorporating those elements of realistic conflicts and troubles into my settings. And you can do that through your villains and the structures that support them. So I hope you enjoyed this little trip to the Cascadon Corner. I hope you like my little weird idea for Sesek being the god of both healing and suffering because I think that's fun. And I look forward to talking next time about some of my ally structures. I think I'll talk to you a little bit about the Church of Asia and the Grey Twin because that's a very fun thing. And I love that dichotomous relationship between those spectrums of good and evil. So anyway, thank you so much for listening and I will talk to you soon. Bye.